A father's homecoming. Sergeant Daniel Carter had been away for almost a year, serving his final deployment overseas. Every night, he held on to the one thing that kept him going, his son, Ethan. At just 10 years old, Ethan was Daniel's whole world. Since losing his wife to an illness 5 years ago, Daniel had raised him alone. He had promised Ethan that this would be his last deployment, and that once he was home, he would never leave again. Tonight was supposed to be special. Daniel wasn't due back for another 2 weeks, but a last-minute leave allowed him to surprise his son. He pictured the look of joy on Ethan's face, imagined pulling him into a tight embrace, and hearing his laughter echo through the house. But as he pulled into the driveway of their small suburban home, a strange feeling settled in his gut. The house was dark. Normally, by this time, Ethan would be watching TV or playing video games. His babysitter, Mrs. Jacobs from next door, should have been there too. Daniel stepped out of his car, gripping his duffel bag. The air was eerily quiet, with only the faint rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. "Ethan," he called. Silence. Flicking on the lights, he scanned the living room. Everything seemed in place. Ethan's school backpack on the couch, his sneakers by the door. But something felt off. Daniel checked the kitchen, the bedrooms, even the backyard. No sign of Ethan or Mrs. Jacobs. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. His heartbeat quickened. He tried calling Ethan's phone next. A faint, muffled ringtone echoed through the house. He followed the sound, leading him to the basement door. Daniel hesitated. He hadn't been down there in months. It was mostly used for storage. The door was locked. That was odd. He had never locked it before. He knocked. "Ethan, you in there, buddy?" No answer. The muffled ringtone played again. Ethan's phone was in the basement. Adrenaline surged through Daniel's veins as he yanked at the doorknob. Locked from the outside. Why? His soldier instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back and kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall, revealing a dimly lit staircase leading down into darkness. "Ethan," he called again, his voice firm but laced with concern. And then he heard it. A soft, broken whimper. Daniel's heart clenched. He rushed down the steps, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner of the basement, huddled beneath an old blanket, was Ethan. Tears streaked his pale face, his small body trembling. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Daniel dropped to his knees and pulled him into his arms. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." Ethan clung to him, sobbing into his chest. Daniel's relief was short-lived. As he held his son close, a chilling realization struck him. Who locked Ethan in the basement? And why? A whispered fear. Daniel had faced war zones, ambushes, and life-or-death situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the moment he found his son locked in the basement, terrified and shaking. Ethan's small fingers clutched at his father's shirt, as if afraid to let go. His body trembled against Daniel's chest, and his breath came in short, uneven gasps. Daniel ran his hand gently through Ethan's hair, trying to calm him down. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here now. You're safe. Just breathe, all right." Ethan nodded weakly, but his grip didn't loosen. Daniel pulled back slightly, scanning his son's face. His cheeks were pale, his eyes red and puffy from crying. His lips quivered as he tried to form words, but the moment he opened his mouth, his whole body shuddered. Daniel's gut twisted. He had expected joy, excitement, maybe even shock at his early return. But this was fear, and not the kind of fear that came from getting locked somewhere by accident. No, this was something deeper, something darker. Daniel inhaled sharply, pushing away the rage rising in his chest. Now wasn't the time for anger. First, he needed answers. "Ethan," he said softly, tilting his son's chin up so their eyes met. "Who locked you down here?" Ethan flinched, his small hands balled into fists, gripping onto his father's jacket. His breathing quickened again, his lips pressing tightly together. Daniel could feel his son's hesitation, like a thick fog between them. "Ethan, look at me," he said gently. "I need you to tell me the truth. No matter what it is, I promise you, I'll make sure everything's all right." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice so small Daniel almost missed it, Ethan whispered, "I don't know." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean, buddy?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. I don't remember." A cold shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. He knew his son, knew when he was lying, when he was hiding something. But this wasn't lying. Ethan was terrified, so much so that his mind seemed to have pushed something away, locked it deep inside where it couldn't hurt him. Daniel had seen this before. Trauma. He clenched his jaw, suppressing the protective rage that threatened to boil over. Someone had done this. Someone had locked his son in the basement and left him there. And they were still out there. Daniel wrapped his arms around Ethan again, holding him tightly. "All right, buddy. We'll figure it out together. Let's get you upstairs, okay?" Ethan nodded, but his grip on his father didn't ease. As Daniel stood, lifting Ethan in his arms, his eyes scanned the basement one more time. His military instincts kicked in, analyzing every detail. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no overturned boxes, but the basement window was locked from the inside, and Ethan was too short to reach it. That meant one thing. Whoever did this had locked Ethan inside, and they had been inside the house. A chill settled deep in Daniel's bones. Carrying Ethan up the stairs, he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, his senses heightened. The house was still, too still. He set Ethan down gently on the couch and knelt beside him. "Did Mrs. Jacobs come today?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "She was here after school. She made me a sandwich, and then—" His voice trailed off, his eyes darting toward the basement door. Daniel followed his gaze, dread pooling in his stomach. "And then what, Ethan?" Ethan's breathing hitched. His hands gripped his shirt, twisting the fabric between his fingers. His lips parted, but he didn't speak. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. Just tell me what you remember." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. "I heard her talking," he finally whispered. "She was on the phone. She sounded scared." Daniel's body tensed. "Did she say anything?" Ethan nodded slowly. "She said, 'He can't find out.'" "Not yet." Daniel's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Who was she talking to? And what was it that he wasn't supposed to find out? Before he could process it, Ethan whispered something else, something that sent ice straight through Daniel's veins. "Dad, I don't think she left the house." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He stood up, scanning the room, every hair on his body standing on edge. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The house had been dark when he arrived, silent. There was no sign of anyone else inside. But if Mrs. Jacobs had never left, then where was she? Shadows in the silence. The air in the house felt different now. Thick, suffocating. Daniel's soldier instincts sharpened as he processed Ethan's words. She never left. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help Ethan. Not now. The house was dark, eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made your skin prickle. The kind that told you something wasn't right. Daniel's mind raced. If Mrs. Jacobs never left, then where was she? And more importantly, was she still here? He turned to Ethan, keeping his voice steady. "Buddy, I need you to stay right here, okay? Don't move from this couch. No matter what you hear, don't get up until I come back." Ethan's eyes widened, fear flickering across his face. "Dad, what's happening?" Daniel forced a reassuring smile. even though every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay on high alert. "I'm just going to check something. I'll be right back." Ethan hesitated, but then nodded. He trusted his father. Daniel could see it in his eyes. Still, as he turned away, he felt the weight of his son's gaze on his back. Daniel moved slowly, his footsteps careful, calculated. His military training had taught him how to navigate dangerous situations, how to stay one step ahead of a threat. And right now, everything in his gut told him that there was a threat inside this house. He checked the front door first. Locked. The deadbolt was still in place. The windows? Secure. That meant whoever had locked Ethan in the basement didn't break in. They had a key. Daniel's jaw clenched. His boots made no sound against the hardwood floor as he moved through the hallway, checking each room one by one. Living room, empty. Kitchen, nothing. He reached the laundry room, pausing for a brief second before pushing the door open. Darkness greeted him. The only light came from the small window above the dryer, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, a creak. Daniel's body went rigid. The sound had come from inside the house. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He wasn't armed. His service pistol was locked away in the bedroom safe, and right now, getting to it would take too long. He needed to be smart. Slowly, he backed out of the laundry room, his ears straining for any sign of movement. Another sound. A faint shuffle. It was coming from the hallway closet. Daniel's breath slowed. He moved toward it, his hand hovering near the doorknob. For a brief second, he considered calling out, but something told him not to. Instead, in one swift motion, he yanked the door open. Darkness. Then, a figure slumped forward. Daniel reacted instantly, catching the weight before it could collapse onto the floor. His breath caught in his throat. It was Mrs. Jacobs. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted. Her body was limp, like a marionette with its strings cut. For a split second, dread seized Daniel. But then, he felt it. A pulse. Weak, but there. She was alive. He lowered her gently onto the floor, pressing 2 fingers against her neck to check again. The rhythm was faint, but steady. Then he noticed something else. A small bottle rolled out from the folds of her cardigan, clinking softly against the wooden floor. Daniel picked it up, his stomach twisting as he read the label. Sedatives. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Had she been drugged? Had someone forced her to take these? Or had she taken them herself? He shook her shoulder gently. "Mrs. Jacobs, can you hear me?" A small groan. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Something was very wrong here, and he was done waiting for answers. He needed to wake her up. Now. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Jacobs stirred on the couch, her eyes heavy, her body weak. Daniel had managed to get some water into her, shaking her gently, until she finally came to. She blinked, disoriented, before her gaze landed on Ethan. Her breath hitched, her expression crumbling. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Jacobs, I need you to tell me what's going on. Now." Her eyes flicked to him, wide with guilt. She shook her head, her fingers clutching the blanket he had draped over her. Daniel's patience thinned. "I found my son locked in the basement. You were unconscious in my closet with a bottle of sedatives. Start talking." Tears welled in her eyes. Her breathing grew unsteady. I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "I was just trying to protect him." Daniel stiffened. Protect him? From what? Mrs. Jacobs closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "From the man who's been watching your house." Daniel's blood ran cold. He stared at her, his pulse thundering in his ears. "What did you just say?" Mrs. Jacobs swallowed hard, her hands shaking. He called me today. He told me if I didn't do exactly what he said, he'd hurt Ethan. Her voice broke. I didn't know what else to do. I panicked. I gave him what he wanted. Daniel's chest tightened. And what was that? Mrs. Jacobs hesitated, her face crumpling with guilt. Then she looked directly at him, her lips trembling. He wanted you to come home early. Daniel's entire body went rigid. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random event. Someone had planned this, and they had been waiting for him. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap, the unseen enemy. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The weight of Mrs. Jacobs' words pressed down on him like a vice. He wanted you to come home early. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had known his every move. Someone had been watching. And they were still out there. Daniel turned to Ethan, his instincts roaring to life. Buddy, I need you to get your shoes on. Ethan hesitated. Dad. Now. Ethan nodded and rushed to grab them. Daniel turned back to Mrs. Jacobs. Do you remember anything else? A voice. A name. Did you see him? She swallowed hard, shaking her head. No name, just a deep voice. Calm, but wrong. Like he'd done this before. He knew everything. Where you were stationed, the day you were coming back, even things about Ethan, like what time he goes to bed. Daniel's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random stalker. This was personal. A trap. A test. And Daniel had walked right into it. He scanned the living room, every nerve in his body on high alert. The house was still. Too still. A creeping sense of unease slithered through him. And then, a single noise shattered the silence. Click, the distinct, metallic sound of a door unlocking. Not from the front. Not from the back. From inside the house. Daniel moved fast. He grabbed Ethan, pushing him behind the couch. Stay down. No matter what happens, don't move. Ethan's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. Daniel turned to Mrs. Jacobs. Pretend you're still weak. Don't react. She swallowed hard and slumped back against the couch, her breathing ragged. Then, Daniel stood up, and he waited. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. A shadow stretched across the floor before a figure emerged, a tall man, dressed in black, his face masked, his posture eerily calm. Daniel's hands curled into fists. He had no weapon, no advantage. But he had something better. Experience. The intruder tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. You're even more predictable than I expected. Sergeant Hayes. Daniel didn't flinch. You must be new at this. The man let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, I assure you, I'm not. His voice. Calm. Cold. Familiar. Daniel's mind raced. Where had he heard that voice before? Then it clicked. The calls. The vague threats his unit had received overseas. The whispers of an unknown enemy, one that had never been caught. This wasn't just personal. This was revenge. You don't remember me, do you? The man mused. Daniel's jaw tightened. I remember the kind of people you are, he said. You hide in the dark. You think you're untouchable. But you're not. The man hummed, amused. Brave words. But this isn't about me. He gestured toward Ethan. This is about him. Daniel's entire body went rigid. The man took a slow step forward. You see, Daniel, soldiers like you leave destruction in your wake. People who cared about you once. Friends, family. You move on. But what about the ones left behind? Daniel's mind flashed through the past. Missions. Decisions. The people he had crossed. You took someone from me, the man said quietly. And now I take someone from you. Wrong move. Daniel struck fast. With the force of years of combat training, he lunged, driving his fist into the man's throat. The intruder staggered back, gasping, but Daniel didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until a blade clattered to the floor. The man barely had time to react before Daniel drove him back into the wall, pinning him with his forearm. "You made a mistake coming here," Daniel growled. The man smirked despite the pressure against his throat. "Did I?" Then, before Daniel could react, the man drove a knee into his ribs, throwing him off balance. He moved fast, too fast. By the time Daniel turned, the intruder had yanked something from his pocket. A gun. Daniel didn't think. He lunged, just as the gun fired. The shot rang out through the house. Mrs. Jacobs screamed. Ethan cried out, and the man fell. Daniel barely registered the pain slicing through his arm. The bullet had grazed him, but he didn't care. He grabbed the gun from the intruder's limp hand, checking his pulse. Still alive, but barely. Sirens howled in the distance. Mrs. Jacobs had called 911. It was over. For now. Epilogue. A new beginning. Days later, the house was quiet again. But this time, it was the kind of quiet that felt safe. The intruder had been taken into custody. Turns out, he wasn't acting alone. Authorities were still investigating. But Daniel knew one thing. This wasn't just some random act. It was a warning. And Daniel was ready. He stood by Ethan's bed, watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in days. Then he felt it. Tiny fingers slipping into his hand. Ethan had woken up. "You're safe, buddy," Daniel whispered. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Ethan didn't say anything. He just squeezed his father's hand, holding on tightly. And in that moment, Daniel made a silent promise. He would never let his guard down again. Because some wars didn't end on the battlefield. Some wars followed you home. And this time, Daniel was ready to fight. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.